This is lesson 3 of writing reports, evaluations, and funding requests. This lesson focuses on organizing your work and editing it. There's 3 steps in this lesson: structuring your report, assessing whether the report has accomplished the purpose and persuades the reader, and 3, editing your writing. Regarding structuring the report, what do you already know about organizing a report, and how do you put those into operation when writing a report? We've all learned a lot of things in the past about organizing the things that we write. For example, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. We start with a story with once upon a time. Some people say state what you write it, and then summarize what you wrote. The APA manual, that's the publication manual of the American Psychological Association, has a whole section on manuscript organization. Take a moment to write down some thoughts about how you would organize the papers that you write, and what kinds of things would you think about in terms of doing that. There's a number of questions that can help you organize your writing. I keep coming back to this question, what's the purpose? Because you're communicating not just information, you're communicating information for a reason when you're writing a report, and you want that reason to be clear throughout the report. Who is the audience? Knowing who the audience is will give you an idea of what kinds of ways you'll be presenting things. What writing styles would best fit? Is this a part where you're describing what's already been written, what's already out there? Or are you analyzing different points, or are you bringing together and synthesizing information from a number of different sources? Are you at a point where you really are persuading the reader? You need to use a writing style that fits those particular purposes and goals. Do you need literature support? Most of the time in reports, you are going to have to find the literature and cite the literature that is evidence for the points and the conclusions you're making. What are the essential parts of your manuscript? Stop and think for a moment. There's an example that comes to my mind that when in the movie industry, now that we have these, DVDs and Blu-rays that are out, they have deleted scenes, and sometimes the director mentions that the deleted scene was something that they really liked, but they cut it because it didn't advance the story. It didn't actually go with what they were trying to do, even though it was kind of a nice little scene. Sometimes we have to be ruthless with what we write, because there may be something we really think sounds well and it's a really interesting point, but it doesn't really support the premise that we're trying to make. Doesn't really add to the conclusion that we're trying to get the reader to agree with. We also want to ask, what are the parts of the report that provide the foundation for the subsequent parts? So this is something that you have to do in terms of sequencing, so that things build as the report goes on, and that you don't have things that you talk about early on that become confusing for the reader because you haven't yet given them the basis for making those, for reporting and presenting that information yet. In addition, you need to communicate the organization from the reader, and you do that in lots of different ways. So here's a number of practical tips for that. In the introduction, you clearly describe the topic, the purpose, and you give a brief overview of the report so they know what's coming. In the body of the report, the conclusion of each point that you make explains how the point relates to the overall purpose of the report. Each point needs to be relevant. Cut the sections that don't advance your analysis. Points are presented in sequence, with each point building on what precedes it. and that you use transitional words and phrases to link the points with each other. It isn't just one point after the other, and the reader is not really sure how they're associated with one another or how they lead from one to the other. It can really be good to use headings properly. Headings should be able to be understood without having to read the content. So there's enough information in the heading to give you an idea of what is going to be in the section that follows them. Headings should identify each of the main points being communicated in your report, and you should use levels of heading to clearly organize the content. If you have more than one level of heading, you've got to remember that the subheadings go within the section for the overall heading, and that you can know where you are in your report by whether your section has a major heading or a subheading listed in it. Don't overuse headings. For example, don't use headings for single paragraphs. Your conclusion should summarize the points that have been communicated and should state how the purpose was accomplished. A few more questions that can help you organize. What points do you want to make in each element? Are your analysis and recommendations clearly written? Does the content exhibit a logical flow of ideas that build on each other? Have you followed instructions? That's really important, that you review the instructions again to make sure that you are including everything that whoever you're sending this to has requested. Have you edited your work? It's very important, because that's going to say whether, lots of times people will consider your level of professionalism by whether your work is well edited. You should always consider your audience. There's a number of different possible audiences when you're doing human services reports. It may just be your supervisor or an agency administrator. It could be an organization or a governmental office. It could be a funding source. You could be writing a report for community members to read, and that could be local, regional, national, or global community members. And each one of these, you have to identify, are there factors that we need to explain that maybe they're not familiar with? There could be very particular stakeholders or decision makers that you're writing this report for. You also have to consider the level of knowledge for your audience. Assess whether the reader will be familiar with the words, the concepts, the theories, the research methods which are referenced in the report. Don't get too detailed, but explain at the level that your audience is going to need. Avoid undefined acronyms and jargon, because even if you are familiar with it, it's not always the best way to communicate. There's a number of tips for helping to organize your paper, and here's 10 that you can use to think about how a paper gets organized. First, you introduce your topic, your purpose, and overview. You start with a description. Sometimes it's helpful to start with a synthesis of literature about the prevalence, the impact, the etiology of a topic. Present the points that support the purpose in a logical sequence so they build on each other. Analyze each point. What is important about the point? What's the validity of the literature related to the point? Explain how they support the purpose and present the writer's analysis, not just the analysis of the cited authors. The fifth point is cite the literature that supports the writer's ideas. Synthesizing supportive literature is stronger than presenting one citation or describing each source in turn. Organize the points in categories rather than by the source authors. Number 6 is explain alternative explanations, gaps, or uncertain information. It's not a good idea to mention alternatives without suggesting an answer or resolution. And when you do mention alternatives, explain how they impact your analysis and recommendations. You need to explain why the reader should accept your explanation rather than one of the alternative explanations that you've referred to. Why did you choose what you chose when there's more than one possibility? That needs to be explained. Number 7 is include real-life examples when appropriate. But be careful about this because you need to respect people's confidentiality. So real-life examples shouldn't include any identifiable information. You need to present the writer's conclusions, your conclusions and recommendations. They should flow from the points which are supported by the evidence. So you are presenting an issue, you are identifying what we know about that issue, what's the evidence that's going to lead to your analysis and your conclusion, and then making a recommendation based on that. There's a certain logical process in terms of doing that. It's important to discuss the implications. How do the conclusions from the report impact practice or research? For example, do they suggest a theory or a model that explains the topic? Do they reveal things that need further research? Do they demonstrate effective interventions? Finally, end with a conclusion which restates your purpose, summarizes the points that illustrate the purpose, does not include new points or content. That's not the conclusion is not a place for adding new information. A conclusion is kind of bringing all the information you've already presented into a brief summary. The conclusion also finally persuades the reader to think or act. I've mentioned a lot about purpose and persuasion so far. We're going to do a few more things about assessing purpose and recognizing that persuasion is a key factor for all reports. Purposes may vary. They may demonstrate a need for services or research. They may propose evaluation, research, or intervention methods. They may present evaluation or research findings. They may demonstrate intervention effectiveness. Some reports have multiple purposes. You should ask yourself, as part of the process of reviewing your report, does it really clearly explain how you accomplished the goal or purpose? For example, if a report's purpose is to propose transportation services to help older adults attend medical appointments, then that report should show evidence of the following issues. Older adults are having difficulty getting appointments. Research in general and specific data from the region can be helpful. The region's transportation services are insufficient to meet the need. Better transportation options would result in increased attendance at medical appointments, which would then lead to improved health outcomes for these older adults. The proposed transportation methods that you're making in the report, they could be increased municipal infrastructure, more accessible service locations, or volunteer drivers. Well, whatever you're proposing needs to be effective and shown to be effective. It also needs to be realistic. For example, if you're a private agency that has a few clients, you can't be proposing, municipal infrastructure, which leads to that final point. The agency has the ability to address the need or is working with partners who can together address the need. So some proposals may suggest methods that are beyond the capacity of a single agency to do. That's when you need to get partners to all come together, and maybe together they can accomplish the purpose. Is your report persuasive? Persuasion doesn't just occur at the end. You just don't kind of say everything you need to say and then at the very end you say, these provide reasons for you to follow this recommendation. You begin by confidently stating the purpose in the introduction. You say that the purpose will be accomplished by the report's analysis or whatever you're going to say your analysis is going to be, put that at the very beginning so the reader knows that this is what you're going to accomplish in the report. Each of your points should end with an explanation that shows how it accomplishes, how it's related to the overall purpose. The conclusion should not simply summarize your analysis and assume that the reader will agree with it. The practical tip is the conclusion should explain why the reader should agree with your analysis. This doesn't just repeat what you've already said, but it takes the points that are strongest and says this is what we really need to do. The final step here is to edit what you've written, and that has to do with writing mechanics, it has to do with clarity, and it has to do with evaluating whether you have sufficient evidence. It's important to edit your grammar, your spelling, your punctuation, your sentence structure. Also important to edit the citation and the reference list format. Errors in writing mechanics can communicate that the writer is sloppy, it does not pay attention to detail, or has poor writing skills. And if you're asking for someone to put a particular program in operation or to fund you, those aren't qualities that those people are going to be looking for. Make sure that you followed all the relevant standards of practice or the instructions. Also edit for clarity, conciseness, and logical flow of information. If the text is unclear, readers will often assume that your points are inadequate. Beware of wordy explanations. Concise presentation helps readers identify the essential points being communicated. Consider whether sequencing of text is logical and uses transitional words or phrases to link points to each other. The resources section in this module contains links related to writing mechanics and writing composition if you need a little bit more information about this. Finally, is there sufficient evidence? You need to consider whether the evidence that you're citing is sufficiently strong. Do you need to find additional literature? Or have you already identified literature or practice knowledge which is stronger than what you've presented? You need to add that in or replace what you've already written with something that's stronger. This is the end of Lesson 3. Review the following example and then practice what you've learned. The following section presents another example that continues focusing on this teen anger management group report. It illustrates the 3 steps in this lesson and again shows a way that you could complete the Lesson 3 writing lab. Use what you've learned, the ideas you've written down in order to complete the Lesson 3 writing lab.